Our guest today is Rashi Kakkar. She works at McKinsey and shared some awesome insights about what makes a great consultant, ways to get noticed, and a couple of really great tips for case interviews. I think one of those tips was so good, it might be the one that gets you the job. So make sure you stick around. Of course, these are her personal views, and they don't represent any organization that she's associated with. So with that all said, let's get to it. Welcome back to another episode of the Career Starter Podcast. My name is Ashley Mesquita, and I'm your host. If you've already subscribed to the show, thank you very much. But if you're new, please go ahead and subscribe, because today, like every day, I'm going to be bringing you amazing guests, and we're going to uncover the tips and strategies that will help you get your dream job. And once you're in that job, help you launch your career and accelerate it like a rocket ship. Okay, I am so excited for this episode with Rashi Kakkar. She works at McKinsey and was really kind of one of my first conversations with someone in your field, Rashi. So I'm really, really excited. And thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Of course. No, thank you for having me. And thank you for doing this. I wish I had this back when I was in school. So happy to, be a part of this conversation and help.
I love it. Rashi, you have such an interesting background, and it feels like every time I talk to you, I learn more about it, and I find it's even more interesting. Can you just talk to us briefly about your background and how you got to where you are today, and then we'll dive into some specific questions.
Happy to. So I consider myself having a very squiggly career, or, to use Taylor Swift's language, I've had a lot of different eras. So in my most recent era, I'm at McKinsey and I'm part of our Leadership and Development Center of Excellence. I joined the firm about 6 years back, straight out of business school. Did the usual associate, kind of became a manager. And now I lead a global portfolio within our Leadership and Development Center of Excellence. And then prior to doing that, there was also a little bit of, a meandering squiggly part. I started with consulting, Bain, took a complete 180-degree pivot and worked in sports management. So I was actually an agent, a professional sports agent. It's a pretty cool kind of story to tell people. It was a lot of fun. Happy to talk more about that if on maybe a later podcast about working in professional sports and entertainment. So did that for a bit. And then again, went back into consulting, but more like design thinking. And I was working with a boutique design thinking firm and had done that for a few years and, decided to go to business school. And that kind of brought me back to McKinsey. And that's pretty much a little bit of the circle. I started with consulting and I'm back in consulting.
I love it. I sense the possibility of one of my first return guests down the road for a further conversation.
Well, I'd love that.
Wonderful. So let's go straight into kind of some of the ideas about consulting. What drew you to consulting in the first place, to the firm you're at, and to the industry in general?
Sure. So I think a couple of things, right? I'm a naturally very curious person. And when I was trying to figure out what do I want to do, I was really struggling with, I guess, figuring out an industry and a function, right? The idea of this is it. And maybe, someone can say I was afraid to commit, but it was I don't know if all I want to do for the next few decades of my life is say marketing in a CPG brand, right? Or ops in a bank or something. And so I was really looking for a place where I could have multiple different, I guess, jobs, exposures to different industries and function, and consulting sort of naturally leans itself to it. I also consider myself someone who's quasi-academic. I don't think a PhD was something I wanted to do, but I like the idea of spending my day reading, writing, and thinking, right? Just working through complex problems, breaking them down, doing that for a few months, jumping onto something else just seemed really exciting to me. And so again, consulting sort of leaned to that. And I think those were two big reasons why naturally I just got drawn to the idea of consulting. And the third, which I've later discovered, is I've always enjoyed working with people. And a lot of times people forget that consulting and advisory essentially is like a human business, right? You're always potentially working with humans, and it's a very people-centric business. And as you sort of rise in it, the people components just become more and more important. And so that to me was also really nice, that I'd spend my day job either surrounded, it's a team sport, either surrounded with a team or working with clients, just always being around humans.
That's really interesting. And it actually flows kind of into my next question that, it's going to sound like a very basic question. What do consultants do? What is the job? What is the role?
Yeah. So now it depends on how and who I'm explaining it to, right? Because if I'm explaining this to my 5-year-old, I try and explain to her that, consultants are like a doctor to a business, right? And both a family practitioner and a general or a specialist, right? So you don't have to only meet them when something's wrong. Though in those cases, sometimes you're brought in to diagnose and figure out, what's wrong and how do you fix it. But also, you should technically be meeting a GP at a pretty regular cadence. Before things go wrong, you stay healthy. A lot of consultants get brought in to look at the health of organizations and business. And that's how I try and explain it, at least to someone at that age. But for someone else, it really is, you're an advisor and you're an independent counselor, advisor. That's what you're trying to do, right? And so it's looking at, it could be an organization, it could be a government entity, it could be just anything, looking at a system. It could also just be a system, and then trying to figure out, depending on what you've been brought in for, right? If there's like a burning problem, it's like, how do you mitigate that? If it's, hey, we want to do some blue sky thinking, helping kind of do that and figure out trade-offs. If it's just advising a human on, McKinsey is kind of known to be a counselor to really, really senior clients like CEOs. So it's advising maybe like senior leaders in large organizations, and being their own independent kind of counselor, right? So it's a bunch of these things, but at its very fundamental, it is someone who has, say, an independent thought, and can advise in a situation but still maintain some distance from it. Like in a lot of ways, what a good doctor should really do is go in with expertise, advise, and then you obviously as the human will make a decision, but they have the expertise to analyze it and give some sort of independent perspective.
I think that's such an interesting way to explain it. I don't think I've ever heard someone describe it that way before, but it makes a ton of sense. When you think about your background, having spent some time in consulting, and you're back to it now, what are the things that surprised you about consulting?
Yeah, so I think, and of course, it depends on what level you're joining and what parts. There are different parts of the firm, but let's say if your audience is very traditional, kind of want to do the traditional consulting post, their undergrad, their business school degrees. I think what's really surprised me was I over-indexed a lot more on the quote unquote hard skills, right? I thought it's going to be how fast can you, I guess, work on an Excel model? How quickly can you create PowerPoint pages, right? And I think that's a narrative that gets shared a lot. I always thought it was also for someone who was very, and I consider myself pretty logical, but I thought it was for someone who was, less creative, but more, I am very numbers kind of focused and driven. And all those are very important things. But that surprised me, because eventually I think success happens. Those are basic, fundamental, you need them in your toolkit. But the people who succeed and do well, in even the first year, are not people who could work through a model the fastest. It really was people who'd be able to develop that human relationship, right? Like the client kind of counseling relationship, great client hands, as we like to call them, and who were able to synthesize information well, who were able to communicate things well, who were able to develop that human relationship with folks in their team, and who were very coachable and open to feedback, right? So I just assumed you've got to come into these firms. There's a lot of pressure. You're working with really, senior clients, and you've got to be prepared for everything on day one. And I thought you've got to be prepared for all those other skills, right? Like I need to be able to do SQL, and I need to know R and Excel, and I need to be able to do all this analysis, or I really need to understand how to create complicated looking PowerPoint pages. But that is not far, that's far from the truth, right? You don't need any of that. It's more, are you ready to, I tell people this, folks who succeed in consulting can read, write, and think well, right? And that shocks people because it seems so simple, but it really is that, right? Can you read well? Can you write well? Can you think well? And then are you able to kind of communicate that well?
I think that's fascinating, because one of my earlier episodes, I spoke with a guy who was doing investment banking, or he'd sort of done 3 years in iBanking and was now in private equity. And what he said was one of the things that surprised him was the degree to which being able to work with people and those interpersonal skills were so much more important than he would have expected ahead of time. And so it's interesting because you consider iBanking, management consulting, two of the most physically demanding and intellectually demanding types of roles. And yet, even in both of those, the hard skills are critical. You have to have them, but it's so much more than that. I think that's just really interesting.
100%, right? And which is why I think for me, even the framing of calling them soft skills, I actually hate the word soft skills. I'm call them human skills is more important. And it's actually more important today because we also are at this point where, obviously AI and its capabilities is getting better, right? So I don't know how much you've used, but if you use Copilot in Excel, or if you even have access to, enterprise level chat GPT, Claude, etc., a lot of that analysis, a lot of taking in large quantities of data and spitting out the right number, machines can do it and will continue to get better at doing it, right? And I think what will make any of us, will give us our edge, is actually doubling down on the human skills, right? Can you build trust? Do you have empathy? Do you understand another person's perspective? Are you able to have a difficult conversation? Are you able to get someone to, action something that you're recommending and take them on that journey? So I'm sure the private equity venture side of things, investment banking has its own set of similar things you need to do. But I think for consulting as an industry, especially 2025, right? It's even more critical for people to over-index maybe on the human skills of communication, building trust, stakeholder management, working with other humans, versus just saying, hey, look, I can under 5 minutes, like spit out a beautiful looking model, right? Like speed of like, you'll never beat a machine when it comes to that.
Yeah. And it's fascinating too, because when I think about the possible career opportunities for people at an early stage of their career, one of the things you said kind of jumped out at me is the value of management consulting as an example. And there's a few that I kind of think of this way. You're working really hard. You learn an enormous amount about a variety of industries, and you're exposed to decision makers and you're in the room potentially when massive scale decisions are made. At minimum, you get to sort of, even if you're not the one deriving that as a very early career person, you're seeing those conversations. Is that consistent with your experience in consulting?
100%, right? And so, yes, like I was in rooms right after my MBA where, I'd sometimes laugh and I'd walk into client organizations where my own business school classmates were, but I was literally like sitting there in their boardrooms with their boss's boss, right? Like looking at a lot of, I think, bird's eye view of decision making, learning a lot about executive presence, etc. And there's definitely some advantage to, being able to go deep into things and having that expertise. And so that's also a great career path. That it's not to say, there are some people who really know what they want and then they choose to stick to an industry and a function, and with decades they really develop that deep expertise in a topic. But I think what makes consulting interesting and why I wanted to do it early on was I have this belief that people who are more resilient in their careers and successful, especially again where we are in the world, need to develop like T-shaped careers. So you've got to early on have a lot of width, so like a T, right? Like width in a few years, and then get the depth, right? Because obviously beyond a point, without the depth, you can't kind of cross a certain chasm or threshold. But I think early on, if you can do that random walk, like you said, you can see different industries, different functions, different problems, and develop that pattern recognition and connect dots. I think it creates like a more resilient career, right? Because you can pivot your careers, you can do other things later, but at some point you kind of go down and get depth, which again in consulting firms you do, because there comes a point when you really have to start kind of speaking and declaring some sort of a major, or like, this is my expertise, right? Like I'm a people practitioner who works with, say, financial services institutions, or I do growth marketing and sales with like tech firms. Like you've got to be able to develop some sort of major minor. But early on, McKinsey and I think a lot of the other firms also really encourage people to be pretty broad.
I think that point you made about pattern recognition is super important, and it comes up in just a variety of places, and you just need a certain amount of volume to be able to start to notice those patterns.
100%. And that's the other thing also with consulting, when people ask me, like, why do consultants, get hired by other organizations, or what makes them attractive? And a lot of people leave consulting, by the way, in like a year or two, right? It's perfectly acceptable to do it for a few years and leave. I also think you develop a pretty high metabolic rate, right? And so in life, input is not always equal to output, but there is something, and I know the 10,000 rules theory sort of got debunked, but there's some truth to it still, right? Because I grew up playing tennis, and I know that sometimes just the hours you would put into like finishing your tennis serve would make you serve better in a game. And so I think with consulting, because it's you're going in and out of organizations and really going through their most challenging problems and being pulled in when it's, the project that's pivotal for them, especially in a place like McKinsey. Like you said, the pattern recognition gets really good, but your metabolic rate also increases, right? So what someone would get exposure to in 10 years, like you probably get exposure to in 2 years. And so I think that's the other thing also. There's obviously a trade-off with, it is a little bit more, I guess, intense than a regular 9 to 5. But especially early on in your career, I think if you flip it and say, hey, look, I'm actually developing this really high metabolic rate and a great pattern recognition, I do think it's again, I have my bias, but I do think it's a great place to start your career in.
Yeah. Just to be clear, when you say metabolic rate, can you just maybe just make sure I understand, or our audience understands what you mean by that?
That's good. And again, sometimes consultants we throw jargon. So it's fair to ask me what that means. I think I just think of it more like the body's metabolic rate, just capacity to move faster. So it's almost like, if you've worked on something which is, let's say, a very ambiguous, difficult problem, it's intense, and you're in the beginning, it's slow, it takes you time. By the time you do it for the fourth time, you're just a lot faster, right? And so a lot of times, a lot of former consultants go into organizations and, rise through them pretty quickly or do well. It's only because it's like, oh, now we're in this ambiguous problem, or you're going to go talk to like a really, really senior executive. You've done it so often that the speed at which you're able to process things and do it just keeps getting better and better. So that's what I mean. It's a little bit of also like your body's done it so many times, but because it's done it so many times, it sort of becomes muscle memory, and then everything becomes faster. So like lifestyle actually does improve for some people also in consulting, right? Like I'd say the first couple of months can be intense, and then it actually starts getting better once you develop the requisite muscles.
That's just such a fascinating observation. So one of the things I do with these podcasts is I'll create a top 3 takeaways from a how do I get this job perspective and career success perspective. I feel like I'm going to have to like do like 10 of these takeaways already just from the early part of this conversation. This is so interesting. You talked about people will leave consulting in 1 to 2 years sometimes longer. What do people do? What's the career path that people experience after consulting?
Yeah, no, it's literally like a lot of different paths, right? I've had people leave the firm in the last couple of years. I mean, very traditional would be just join different organizations, do strategy ops kind of stuff there. I've had people join private equity, join venture firms. I've had someone get into film production. I've had someone become a full-time actor. I know someone who's now writing a book. I know a lot of folks who get into not-for-profit. I know lots of folks who, I know someone who left to go become an elementary school teacher. So it really is all over the place. And I think there's a lot of different career paths outside the firms. There are lots of career paths within these firms too. So a lot of these firms, especially the big ones, right? They're large, giant corporations with 40, 50,000 people, global organizations, and there are multiple paths. And so for different reasons, people also meander in and out, right? Like you can go join, like I'm doing a center of excellence. There are people who actually discover a love for a subject, and they're like, I just want to be an expert in this space. And so you can do that. There are people who, fall in love with, say, marketing, and they decide to do marketing and public relationships for the firm, right? And so similar to large corporations, there are also multiple pathways that are available within these firms. And I've got friends in other firms too, and they've also sort of meandered in and out. So there's a lot of things people do. It's not really necessarily linear, and I think that's the whole point about consulting and optionality. It truly is one of those post school roles you do, where in a couple of years you can test things, and then it gives you one more shot at doing something else, right? Like, and then people discover things they like, they don't like, and then the career paths are very wide. And the other one I forgot is entrepreneurship. I was actually, this question came up a few maybe months back, and people talk about the PayPal mafia, a bunch of PayPal folks who went and who founded big companies. So someone was like, hey, which are the big Canadian, and this was in a very Canada context, big Canadian companies which have their own sort of like entrepreneurship mafia, and Shopify names came up, and I was like, have you considered McKinsey? And then someone actually wrote the names of all the big Canadian like tech startups and just companies started by former McKinsey people, and the list just went on and on. It was at least like 40 names, and this is all Canada and like some of them in the US. And again, I grew up in India, so I have folks there. Like there are lots of ex-McKinsey folks who are now entrepreneurs, and so that's the other big career path is entrepreneurship.
Right on. That's really interesting. You touched on something obviously very important to sort of people considering a career in consulting. It's a demanding role. It's not, your average 9 to 5, as it were. And so how do you think about how do you think about that? And then how do you think about managing the work-life balance of that?
Yeah, no, great question. And I'd say, I'll tell you how I think about it is I know we were mentioning this before we hit record, that I wanted to grow up to be a professional athlete. Separate story that didn't happen, but I really viewed consulting, and I still do, as being a corporate athlete, where it was like, there's in seasons and off seasons. And that's how I viewed my life, where I was like, when I'm in a 2-month intense project, it's in season, right? It's going to be demanding. I'm going to probably work a little longer than I do. I'm going to, and then obviously things change once you have a family, but it was very clearly, me and my partner knew what to expect, right? That I'd probably be working a couple of hours longer than usual. Maybe I'd do some post-dinner, not maybe, most times I was working post-dinner, etc. But then I was also very conscious of taking that off season, right? And so we have things where it's called take time, and different firms have this program where you can take 2 months of sort of leave distributed through the year. So I was very conscious of making sure I was getting those rests, right? Because when I'm on a project, but then I was making sure I was getting periods of like off recovery time, right? Which was, okay, I've done like one intense project, I've done 2, and I don't want to head towards burnout. And so it was like, okay. And because you were in a very project-based place, it's very easy to then say, I'm out for a month and a half, right? You just don't get staffed on a project. Obviously, as you rise in firms, it sort of changes, because, once you are a partner, you really balance comes in different ways. But I think given the focus is early tenured folks for this podcast, at least, I think one of the best ways to do it is to get into this mindset of when I'm on, and then I have to be responsible for being off. So I think that was just like one general thing I did. And then there was a little bit of micro habits, right? Like I always tell people, setting boundaries is very important. And that's a earned privilege in a lot of places. It's not a right. And what I mean by that is the first couple of months, right? Like do a really good job, establish like credibility, become known for good work, and develop your toolkit, right? When you're learning anything new, there's a learning curve. It would likely take longer to do something. Once you've established that, then it's very easy to set boundaries. And so for me, once I established that, and I went back to the firm after my maternity leave with a daughter, it was very clear boundaries that between this hour and this hour in the evening, I am not available unless there's a literal fire. I am off, right? Or if we have to travel, then obviously we'd go to a client site, but instead of me getting there Monday morning, could I get that Tuesday, right? Could we do it Tuesday to Thursday, or Tuesday and me flying out late Wednesday night, right? So I could get extra nights at home with my child. And so it was a little bit of like then these micro habits and boundary setting, which would help. And then obviously once I kind of moved into a more manager role, there's a little trade-off, but you also then have that power of prioritization and ruthlessly asking, using different people use different things, but like the Eisenhower matrix or something saying, hey, what's really impactful? What's really important? What do I really need to do to move the needle? And what's the good to have stuff, right? And so those were probably like 3 things that I did in general to make sure I wasn't completely burned out and I'm still here after, 5.5, 6 years.
That's really interesting because it enables it to be a marathon and not a attempted sprint for for a marathon distance. Staffing is something that is often a topic that comes up in consulting firms, and getting staffed on projects and that kind of thing. Can you just talk a little bit about, if I haven't defined it properly, if you can just explain briefly what it is, and then how that all works in a world where you're whatever this 2 month sort of throughout the year flex, or maybe I'm not explaining it correctly, but
yeah. So again, just focused on early tenure, and different firms do this differently, right? So you'll talk to somebody else from another firm, they might have a different system. But what we have like professional development managers. So they're not just staffers, they're supposed to be people coaches, etc. And each person gets one, right? And so I work with mine. So let's assume, Ashley, you're my We'll have our initial meeting. I'll tell you who I am. I'll tell you generally these are things I'm interested in. These are things, my strengths, weaknesses, sort of. Early on, I'm a blank slate. And in the beginning, you will find me the right project, right? Like you'll find me a project, which again, you can't always have the unicorn. Sometimes they magically appear, but you'll generally try to find me something which is interesting to me in a industry or space I want. If I have some certain constraints, some people do where maybe they can't travel for whatever reason. Like you try your best to accommodate as much as possible, and you find those for me, and you do get their support. Like at least till you are a pretty established manager. But also, what starts happening is you start developing your own relationships, right? So they help you find the right next sort of projects. But as you start working with people, you develop mentorship, sponsorship relationships where they also start pulling you in. So it's a little bit of like, it's a two-way thing where early on, you obviously walk in with like 0 relationships, 0 reputation. But then as you start working, a little bit of that develops. So it's not literally like you've been left all alone. And so they do work with you, right? If I tell them, hey, look, I'm going to be off for like 2 months, like I'm off for 2 months, like I've got take time, I've got PTO that's accounted for, right? And so you'll obviously time it to a project so that, okay, my project's ending on a Friday and then I can start it on a Monday. So there's a little bit of like flexibility, I think, you have to keep. And with consulting firms in general, like there are obviously periods when you can definitely take PTO, right? Like say the winter. Summer usually becomes a bit slow, but then sometimes I wouldn't go ahead, and unless I really had to and I knew it was a non-negotiable, I would say, okay, I know sometime in October, September, I'd probably do something. I got staffed on a project or a study, as we used to call it, and I would tell my staff, or they'd be like, this is like 15, 20 weeks, or it's 10 weeks. I'd say, okay, I'm going to do this for 10 weeks. And then for about 2 weeks, I just want to take time off. And that was fine. Like, it was just, okay, you've taken time off after you do this.
And it kind of this is sort of the second instance where it's jumped out that establishing credibility early matters a ton. And sort of your internal brand or reputation or whatever you want to call it 100%. In those early days makes a huge difference.
Yes. That was one of the best pieces of advice, I think, that a very senior partner gave me. I remember, I had started at the firm and I was just in the beginning, kind of talking to a few people. And I remember the senior partner, I had a conversation with her and I was just like, hey, like, I'd like to do well here. What are your tips, tricks? And she's the one who told this to me. She said, hey, look, like trust and credibility are both earned. They're not rights and privileges. You're working in a very performance-driven place. You're working with everybody who's pretty much world-class, right? And so her advice to me was, she said, this is counter to what people will say. I will say for your first 5-6 months, give everything your 110, 120. If you need to go over and above, if you need to, spend almost like, 30 minutes extra to really polish something or take it to the next level, do it. Because once that gets established, it was like, once you've got your chips in the casino, you have chips to trade, right? And I think that was such good advice because as my life stage kind of started changing, I actually felt like, okay, great, I had those chips to trade in for things, right? And so I know this is not to say, hey, look, like, people should not aim to have balance in life. And by no means am I saying work crazy hours. And I took all my weekends off, right? I can probably in my 6 years at the firm count on my hand the number of weekends I've worked. And when I say weekends, it's a couple of hours on Saturday, Sunday. And a lot of times it was like self-driven because I wanted to get ahead of the work week or, I had a doctor's appointment on Friday. And so I was just catching up with things. But it's saying that when you're working, you truly are focused, right? You're not sort of distracted. You're not on social media. You're not sort of halfway doing things and then like being miserable. And also recognizing in the beginning, there will be some nights which will be late and that's okay, right? Like as long as you get your down periods too.
And it's got the ancillary benefit of if you're putting in that, real full force effort early on, you also are likely to develop in terms of your skills and abilities and what you alluded to earlier about that, your metabolism, basically. You sort of start to kick that into gear a little sooner potentially.
Exactly. And it's also one of the best times to, again, you can develop your toolkit anytime, but when you're early on, like 5-6 months, the reality is nobody expects much of you except they don't want you to blow things up, right? And sure, once you come post business school, there's maybe slightly more expectations, which is fair versus someone coming out of undergrad. But still, in general, it's the best time to like do the difficult things and learn. And so her thing to me was early on, run to the fire. If there's a really difficult project, which sounds really uncomfortable, do it. Because in the beginning, you really have nothing to lose. Even if it does not go well, right? You've at least learned something and it's much easier to be in that situation 1 month in versus being a year in, right? Where you're doing something really complicated and you have no idea what to do, but people expect you've sort of had the reps to figure it out. And so I think that was like I mentioned, just good advice. Like you said, you develop faster. You should always feel comfortable asking stupid questions, but the early on, it just comes more naturally, right? Like, I don't know, nobody told me how to do this or teach me how to do this. And as you obviously progress in organizations and companies, it just becomes a little harder to sometimes be like, I have never seen this before, or I have no clue how to start.
So just out of curiosity, did she have any other golden piece of advice that you want to share?
I thought this whole credibility tips thing was really good. I thought the other piece of advice, which was a little bit, and I don't know if this was consulting or this was also because I was coming from a different kind of geography. I'd grown up in South Asia and a different work environment, was also, don't be afraid to actually have an opinion and push back. And even if you are the junior most person in the room, have an opinion. And yeah, actually a partner told this to me because, we'd go in for these steerco conversations. We'd sit in these like boardrooms. And he said, hey, look, like I don't want any spectators in any meeting. And so you are closest to the data. You are closest to this work stream. And if the discussion comes up, you should be able to like speak to it, right? And you're armed with facts and you should be able to agree and disagree and like have a perspective. And so I think that was also for me very aha, because I thought, okay, early on, my job's just to be the doer, to sit, get some instructions or be like, do this and then go in a corner and do it. But I think in a lot of consulting firms, at least especially in the one I'm in, this whole idea of like you having your own perspective, you being able to, one of our values is obligation to dissent. The idea of I should have an opinion. I should, if I disagree with something, I should voice it is really, really valued. So that also I think was a pretty good piece of advice for me, which was, don't be afraid to kind of share a perspective. Don't be afraid to push back if you disagree with something. Don't be afraid to just share an idea and follow it through, right?
Okay, Rashi, super interesting stuff so far. Let's talk a little bit now about getting to the interview stage. I don't think you're going to fall over in surprise that a lot of people listening to this are potentially interested in getting into consulting. So let's dive into that process a bit. And let's start at a very high level. If you can just describe for me like the process a student goes through from sort of your more typical process of I'm interested in consulting and I go through my, the various parts of the process and I get an offer. Can you just walk us through that?
Sure. So again, for a lot of folks who are, in universities and schools, I think the first place just to figure out is if you have a career center is to say, hey, like, do we have a relationship with, and a lot of universities have with a lot of firms, but it's just figure out, do we have that relationship? In a lot of cases, the answer could be yes, no. Then it really is for a lot of, so for our firm, we've got relationships with a few schools. Every year consistently we go there, right? We go there multiple times. We go there to do info sessions. We go there to do panels, depending sometimes for certain groups or certain affinity groups, you go there for like these career nights. A lot of schools again have, Management Consulting Association, which brings in a bunch of firms, etc. So I think the first place just is to figure out avenues where you can go kind of meet and learn about all these firms. And just when they come to your university, I think is one of the best places to go meet people and learn. The other place, which is really, really great, is also just alumni, right? So it depends. Sometimes you might have like upper years, etc., who've interned at these places, or if you're in business school, may have also like worked at these places. So I think that's the second place, is like go to them, learn from them about different firms, their cultures, what makes A different from B. Once you talk to enough people from these firms, from afar, they all look similar. They are, but they're also slightly different. And so you'll start figuring that out. And then it's usually a pretty streamlined process, right? When you're in school, there'll be applications, if you've got, depends again on which year you're in, but if it's for internship, sometimes in fall, for next year summer it starts, there's a application. You kind of submit your resume. McKinsey very clearly does not ask for a cover letter, and we tell people do not send cover letters. We don't read it. So it really is, you send in your resumes. There's a very robust screening process that takes place in our firm, where a group of alumni together are created. It's almost like a committee, and the recruiters do their first line kind of reviews of the resume. So you might get, say, 300 resumes, right, from one school. So they'll do the first pass, and then they kind of pick maybe the most attractive, say 40, 50, and then it goes to all of us, and each of us independently scores it, and then it's kind of then averaged out. So it's to prevent any bias for someone coming in, right? And it's also I know a lot of things about the school, so I know if someone's really making something up, or how complicated. There are certain clubs which were just complicated to run versus some others, right? Just a president of Club A is not always equal to president of Club B. So I think stuff like that, just having alumni look at it helps. And so you do that. There's a discussion that takes place. It's not just taken on scores. Clear yeses are obviously invited. Borderline cases are discussed. Every time we meet candidates from a certain school, we have different recruiters who look at that school. So if you and I met and I was like very impressed with the coffee chat, I'd go back and just message the recruiter saying, hey, I think Ashley's like kind of great. They're also kind of invited in. We also have this high potential candidates that get invited in for a breakfast and to meet and greet. So anyway, all this stuff happens, and let's just say a certain group, and I'm just throwing out a number, there's no quota, but let's say 20 people get shortlisted, right? And then they're invited for interviews, and everybody kind of goes through the interview. And then again, there's no real quota, there's a bar. And if you meet the bar, you get an offer. It's as simple. And then, you just basically sort of clear the interviews, and either you get an offer, or as I was telling you, I think one of the best things that the firm does is, even if you don't, that very day, we're also pretty clear about giving people information pretty quickly and not keeping them hanging for weeks. So that evening itself, you'll get a call saying, hey, congratulations, you've moved to the next round, or you have an offer, or we made a decision, and unfortunately it's a no, and a reason. I mean, we'll give you feedback.
Okay. And so lots of little nuggets there to follow up on. So my background obviously is in finance, and for iBanking, for equity research, stuff like that. What I advise people to do is find alums from your school who are there, do coffee chats with them, understand the company, understand the role. Do this long before recruiting is started, because if you're doing it while recruiting is started, you're a little bit probably late to the game, and you're hoping that they go back and talk to the recruiter and say, hey, I just met with so-and-so, sharp person, we should definitely have this person in our candidate pool. And that sounds like a similar sort of broad strokes concept to what you're describing.
To a high level, yes. Though I'd say, from what I've heard, again, I wasn't interviewing for iBanking or finance roles. I think a lot more emphasis is given on networking. I think with consulting, even if you don't have to meet everybody at the firm. Even if you met one or two or did not, but your resume really does have things which are stellar, you could still possibly get invited, right? So there is a little bit of yes, if you've met me and everything's great, or I can go and be like, hey, Ashley was great. But if Ashley also just submits like his resume and 6 people independently look at it and we score it pretty high, we'd still most likely invite you, right? So it's a bit of both, I'd say, where networking is important, but it's not the only thing, which I suspect is also in finance, right? It's like, yes, like networking is important, but that's probably not the only thing that gets you through to an interview.
Yeah. So then that sort of goes to the next question, which is what makes a stellar resume? I mean, there's no, like, I don't know, that probably is a perfect candidate, but like when you think about the real world of humans, like what are the, if you were to construct a candidate out of whole cloth, if you will, and create a resume someone has, what are some of the things that would really stand out that, the majority of people at the firm who are scoring it would score quite high on different criteria?
Yeah. So obviously, I'm not going to disclose the rubric because that is a sort of rubric. But I think generally, look, like I tell people, there's something about their past they can control, and there's something they can't, right? So it's a good balance. It's not that, hey, if you have a 4.0 GP and everything else is below average, you're going to get it, right? So I think it's good balance across all, and maybe one spike somewhere. So what that means is, academically, okay, are you doing okay? And that by no means means 4.0. It's like, it's respectable, 3.2, 3.3, 3.5, whatever.
Oh, wow.
You've got to kind of see where the variability is, but it's got to be, if it's above that, it's fine. Like, I don't know how much was mine now, but it was definitely close to during my internship time in my first year, it was like the 3.4, 3.5 mark. Like,
Okay.
I did not that in my second year because I finally got to do subjects I was interested in, but it wasn't like, I was not a 4.0, right? Then it's a little bit of, again, different firms care about different things. I think impact ownership really matters to a place like ours. And so if you go on the website, it's pretty clearly laid down the values we have. So, are you someone who's taken certain initiative, right? It's in your personal or professional capacity. Are you someone who's done something at a certain level, right? So you could be an athlete or a dancer, and if you were an Olympian, that obviously like means something, right? If you played varsity, that means something. So it's a little bit of like, even outside like the professional aspects of your work, have you done something interesting? And then when it comes to your professional aspect, can you did you do something, and are you able to link the impact, right? And again, this is all contextualized because early on in your career, unless you really were running like $1 billion startup, like there's limits to it. But it also is sometimes people just write a laundry list of tasks, which is not helpful. It's like, okay, what was the so what? Like, this was my role and this is what I did. This is what I drove. If you took any sort of initiative, and sometimes it could also be, I just got like, I don't know, I raised my hand for a community cleanup drive, right? That also shows a little bit of initiative. I think stuff like that. So all that really helps to create this like rounded personality. And I think everybody doesn't need it, but if you really have a spike somewhere, like I mentioned, the Olympian, right? Like, great. There are people who are writers, right? Like being a published author, great. Like a podcast, great. Like, it shows that you're someone who's also doing things outside work and you've taken initiative. So I think all that stuff helps. It's a little bit of, what are you doing in school? What are you doing outside school? What have you done at work? Just bringing that whole story together.
And I think when I think about like why some of those things are interesting, I'm sure you know this, but just for the sake of our audience, the thing I think about, and maybe you disagree, correct me if I'm wrong, the thing about, someone who was an Olympian or a varsity athlete or, had started something of their own, it's a proxy for, I can really be dedicated to something to perform at a high level because of the effort it takes, the commitment it takes, the desire to learn to be great at something.
100%, right? And I would agree. I think people who just stick around and do things, I think it's the same thing. A lot of people say want to write or create newsletters or write podcasts or, pick up a sport. But it's like, were you able to grind through it and actually do it, right? Did you abandon it after two shots at it? Or were you able to just like do it for like 5 years, 6 years? For some people, it's like, since I was age 4, I've been doing this, right? And so you're right, it becomes a proxy for this idea of like, you have resiliency, determination, you can see things through. For people who start things on their own, there's that whole idea of like, you're entrepreneurial, you're able to, operate, like you're a self-starter. And I think not just like in consulting, but I think generally if someone can exhibit those qualities, I'd say it just works, I'm sure, in a lot of organizations, especially for students, right? And when you're in the same school, in a way, you're also competing with very similar sort of people, right? Because that whole idea of like, your school and your brand gets negated. It's everybody's going there. And so the edge comes through I think highlighting some of these things that make you a little bit more unique and not shying away from there. So I always tell people in your resume, people do the education and they write the work. And then there's that little bit about personal interests. I actually tell people, don't think of that as just something blah, where you say, I enjoy reading, traveling, listening to music. That's just doesn't actually use that space, because sometimes that space itself might be the reason why you get invited, because that's such a spike, right?
Love that you said that, because it's something I talk about all the time, and that, every inch of your resume needs to do work for you. And if you put something sort of like blah and anodyne, well, you just kind of wasted that space. And you could have used that to either communicate something interesting or tell yourself, actually, I should be doing something more interesting that does jump off the page when someone looks at it.
Exactly, right. And I think also that's the other flip side to it is some sort of authenticity, right? Because it's also not a formula. It comes out very clearly, right? If you think that's missing, but I'm just going to start I don't know, I'm just going to go join a charity for 2 weekends to put it there, then you're better off not doing it, right? So it's a little bit of, I'm not trying to tell people, hey, if you're in business school, you had no interest, it's too late. It's maybe a little bit of reflecting. Everybody has something, right? And especially for a lot of people who are going to grad programs, you've already done this for your application. You've probably already reflected on who you are, your unique self. So it's about not shying away from it. I just think for certain organizations and roles, people over index on I need a 4.0 GPA, and it comes at the cost of other things. And it's fine if you're the 4.0 GPA and you've got perfect scores, that still gives you a big spike in one. But if everything else is very blah, that may not still, somebody who's more balanced everywhere else and then one spike might actually get that shot at an interview.
It's funny you say that, because it is, I think, so important to recognize sort of it's a fuller picture than just one thing. And if one thing is a little bit behind where you want it to be, if you can really make up for it, I mean, as long as it's not a catastrophe.
Yeah.
If you can make up for it in other areas.
Exactly. And in a lot of places also, there's GPA blind kind of resumes, right? And so,
Oh, really?
yeah, a lot of schools also do that, and where they just black out everybody's GPA, and it's we don't even, whatever this person's, especially in a lot of business schools and stuff, increasingly they've been doing it where it's all of these people have been vetted academically, they've all obviously taken the GMAT, they're all surviving in this business school, so just take it out of the equation, just look at them without
Interesting.
number.
Now, you had a different journey to get to your interview stage. Can you maybe talk about that and sort of what stood out to you and what you think in retrospect, you're like, I'm really glad I did that?
Yeah. So I know I was mentioning this, that I possibly got third time lucky. We can come to that later. But in the business school context, I genuinely was just curious about early on exploring a bunch of different career paths. I had a strong hypothesis of, okay, certain paths I don't want. But then there was this whole host of career paths from tech, CPG, consulting, that I was just curious about. And so I was going for as many of these industry nights and, kind of career fairs or company kind of meet and greets as much as I could, and also talking to alumni. So this I don't recommend someone does it because they think it's a formula. I mean, this worked for me, right? So operating from that place of curiosity, I remember going in for this was very early on, but I think a bunch of consulting firms had come on campus, and I was just talking to a bunch of people, and then I remember going to the table where a couple of McKinsey folks were there, and they were surrounded by a bunch of people. So you kind of do your introduction, and this one person we were kind of chatting, and they were asking me about what makes me interested in consulting. And I said, hey, look, I've kind of experienced working in a consulting firm before. I used to work with Bain. And then we just got into a conversation about consulting and about me telling him things that I think are great and things that I think could be a threat to the industry, right? I said, look, I left the industry. I worked in a smaller design shop. There are certain things that I think fundamentally could be challenging, or I don't know how the business has thought about it. And we just got into a very interesting conversation about the business of advisory consulting as a profession. And towards the end of the night, politely, obviously this person gave me their card. I politely took it and said, thank you. You have name tags and stuff. So they sort of looked at my name and they repeated it to themselves, and that was it. And then I remember maybe a day or two later, I forget exactly when, an email popped up on my student kind of email ID from a recruiter in McKinsey saying that, hey, are you free this Friday? Do you want to just come over to our office for a coffee chat? Which I was like, okay, this is interesting. So of course I went to the office, and it was a very interesting conversation where this recruiter was trying to tell me more about the firm, and I was very interested in design and strategy and this marriage of the two, and they were obviously trying to tell me how the firm was kind of on that journey and they were expanding their design practice, etc. So it was a very fascinating conversation where towards the end of it, the recruiter said, and, we'd really encourage you to apply for a summer and we think it could be a great summer with us. And in my head, I was like, yeah, I was obviously going to apply. Like, you don't have to sell the firm to me. But it was very interesting because it suddenly felt like they were not selling, but they were trying to convince me that this might be a great place to come spend the summer, right? And so to me, as I reflected on it later, and I'd done a lot of marketing work, I was like, okay, maybe I was just more memorable to this person because when they were surrounded by groups and groups of students together, everybody was trying to tell them, I love the firm, I want to join it, it's the best firm in the world, and probably having questions around, what's a day in the life or tell me an interesting project. But he and I just got into a very interesting conversation, right? And so I was just thinking it was probably this person, may have met 100 people that day, and maybe just my name stuck and they reached out to the recruiter. So yeah, which is interesting. I haven't actually spoken to this person. Maybe I should ask them what was it about that conversation that got you interested in reaching out to a recruiter and them calling.
I have a hypothesis about that, actually. One of the interesting things is having, now spoken to a lot of people about this kind of stuff. One of the things I've observed is that there's a massive difference on the other side of the table from question, answer to a robust discussion where it sort of feels like you're already colleagues almost. And the closer you can bring those things, bring that into place, the more you're having a discussion with the person, the better your chances, I think. And if I think about your background, having already done consulting before, understanding it a little better, you're having a richer discussion. You've probably had a much richer discussion with that person than many of the conversations they had through the day.
I think that's likely it. And I think the other thing, as I reflect back on it, and I think also what makes people successful in interviews is almost, and by no means am I saying, you should play hard to get, but it also is you're not desperate. And I think sometimes when you're desperate, what happens is you put so much pressure that you get into your own head because you feel like this is it, like this is my one shot. If I lose this, then, life is over. And I think just being relaxed and saying, hey, like I literally was like, this is a conversation. They were like, apply. I was like, okay. They were like, interview. I was like, okay. You get it, you don't get it. I wasn't devastated, right? It was like, this is all interesting conversations. I'm meeting some interesting people. I'm getting to build relationships. So I think I was maybe at ease. And to your point, on the other side, especially now that I interview people and I meet people in these exact environments, right? In these circles where there's like 20 people around you, you can read body language, and just something about someone relaxed and at ease almost kind of eludes confidence, right? It's like, wow, like, okay, this person's like sure of themselves and they're pretty confident they'll land something. There's no desperation.
And then, it's so funny now that I think about it too, like everything is a proxy for other things, right? Because in that setting, it's reasonably high pressure as a student because, there's only so many times that, McKinsey comes to your campus. So there is a level of importance to it, but that's not massively, well, it's different, but of a different scale. But conceptually, it's not that different from you're having an important meeting with a client. And how are you going to carry yourself?
Right? Because at the end of the day, like you represent the firm in every instance. And at client side, sometimes, you are going to be sitting one-on-one with a director, VP, senior VP on your first day on the job. And so exactly that whole idea of client hands, executive presence, can you conduct yourself? Do you have some gravitas? I think is very important, right? And so to your point, I think it's not direct. And that's what I tell people when people ask me, because the story gets shared a lot in these, recruited events, etc. I go on. I always tell people this is by no means like a formula, right? I did it because it felt authentic to me. That's maybe something people can reflect on, but also don't become contrarian just for the heck of it, right? Because you're like, if I'm going to be contrarian and, raise my hand and ask like some outlandish, bizarre question or like be like, gotcha, or, it may not work. I wasn't trying to do that. I was genuinely just trying to have like a interesting conversation with this person. And I was doing it in a very respectful manner, even though we were disagreeing. It was with a lot of like, I hear you, this is my perspective, this is why. And so I always also caution people that I am by no means telling 20 people to go there and just like start becoming all contrarian and throwing curveballs at someone and, making them sweat for no reason.
No, that's really interesting. When I think about interviewing more broadly and then, specifically to consulting in your firm, I'm kind of the view that you need to have a great answer, not a great answer, but like a reasonably good answer for me of why do you want to work here, right? I've gotten in, having done a lot of interviews over the years. I mean, I've had answers that are basically a version of, well, I'm looking for somewhere to exchange my time for money, right? And it's like, well, gee, thanks. You're making me weak at the knees with all this flattery here. Because there's like, if you don't know what you're getting into, if you don't have a good reason to want to be there, when you get there, you might go, oh, wow, this is not really what I wanted or thought it was. Is that similar in consulting? And do you care about, one, why do you want to work here versus everywhere else? And two, why do you want to do consulting? Is that important for people to understand?
Not at our firm at all, not at the interview stage. And I'll tell you why. I think that's a very important question for people to reflect on. And I think, again, different firms are different. So I cannot speak to the other firms in their interview process. I think that's a very good question for me as a candidate to ask, because it's you should also be rejecting places, right? Like ideally, you should also be saying this place is not going to be a fit, or asking those questions in the initial stages. At our firm, because, we want to be as objective as possible and take out any biases, our interviews, again, if you go online, it's literally laid out. Everybody, there are two parts to the interview which are evaluated: the personal experience component and then the case. So the case is the case, and we can come to it. And the personal experience component also, we've got a set of like these values or dimensions we're trying to test. And how it works is that I'll ask you a question on a certain situation. We pick one story, and then we keep questioning and unpacking that story for 20 minutes. And the idea is for you to be able to truly talk to it, for me to see different aspects of what you did, how you felt, how that one felt, like a 360-degree almost awareness of that situation. And that is evaluated across a few dimensions, and then the cases. So obviously in the beginning, a lot of times people introduce themselves, but in the formal interview, you'll never ask a person, why the firm, why consulting. The idea is that hopefully you've had that thinking and you've thought through that. That is why, you've arrived at this place that you want to interview with us. And the other thing is also, our interviews are not like gotcha. This sounds crazy, but it's literally one of the least stressful interviews I ever went through. And I always tell this to candidates also who interview. And a lot of them agree towards the end of it. They're like, this was actually fun. Because our, again, belief is our interviews are not a place to cut people and eliminate. It's actually, we want you to succeed. And so as an interviewer, it's an interviewer-led interview style. So I want you to work with me the way you'd work with a client, right? So when we're doing a case, I want you to involve me in it, ask me questions. If I'm giving you a sort of hint directionally, I want you to take it. I want you to invite me into your thinking. It's not like a stress interview. We don't want you to sweat. We actually want you to clear the bar. And internally, if I interviewed someone and they made it, it's like you feel great about it. You actually go, it's not like, hey, we need two people, or you're the person who rejected everybody, so woohoo to you. It's more like, how many people are actually moving to the next round? And so therefore, at least in McKinsey, once you get the shortlist for an interview, you actually get to prep. Like the firm gives you resources and case prep, including a case prep buddy. I had like an associate who spent like 2 weeks, and we did like 3 mock cases together to prep. Like this was McKinsey provided it, like a McKinsey employee, after I was shortlisted. So it's slightly different than other firms, where once you've kind of been invited into the process, the firm actually wants you to succeed and get the job.
Wow. Knowing the importance of the case part, I want to just touch on that briefly after. But when you think back to your process, and I actually forgot to mention this, I wanted to follow up on it, is that I think you told me you didn't end up getting that summer spot.
That is correct. And so, like I said, there are 2 components to the interview: the personal experience and the case. And so the way it was done, and the latest, again, the details can be on the website, or a recruiter would be able to tell if some things have changed. But back when I was interviewing, the first round was like 2 back-to-back interviews with they were, I think, both senior associates sort of transitioning. One was already and I think the other was becoming but so the interviews are 1 hour each. There is, like I said, about 20 odd minutes for the personal experience and about 25 minutes for the case, and a little bit of time in the end for questions if you have for the interview in the beginning, a little bit of like getting people comfortable and helping them understand the process. And both components of the interview are equally weighted. So again, that's another failure mode where people think in McKinsey, the first 30 minutes is me just talking, you'd come unprepared, and it's the case that matters. It's actually both that matter. These 2 people interview you. They ask you obviously different cases, different personal experience questions, and then they go in and have a discussion with the recruiter. And both have to say a yes for you to proceed to the next round. Like even if there's a maybe, then there's a little bit of a debate. And, why is it a maybe? Yes, it has to be like yes to move. And in my case, the first time I did it with one interviewer, there was tick on both. The other one, the case was great. They were like, no problem at all. And my feedback was that in the personal experience interview, I forget the specific question, but it was something about ownership, etc. I was using a lot of we framing versus I framing. And so as they reflected, they said, look, the story was great. It showed initiative. It showed ownership. But for us, because we were really trying to understand ownership, we didn't know how much of it was self-driven and truly you owning something and driving impact versus how much of it was like a manager or somebody else just telling you to do something and you sort of execute it. And it was like a win for a team, but we don't know what was Rashi's role in it, right? And as I thought about it, they were really pushing me. This person was really pushing me to say, but no, what did you do? What did you do? And I kept going back to the we language framing. So that feedback was very helpful. And they said, look, we still really like you. We still think you can, be successful at the firm. And if you'd be open to it, we'd want to stay in touch with you. So I said yes. And then I was enrolled into a program where monthly, I think there were webinars happening and case prep and stuff. I would get invites for it. I was like, okay, this is interesting. And then they did actually interview me again in the summer. They called me early before they went back to school, before I wrapped up my internship, to see if I wanted to kind of interview again for full time. And so then the process followed, right? Was first round, I did both interviews. That was yes. And then my final round was 4 sort of back-to-back interviews with partners and senior partners, same format, right? Personal experience case, personal experience case, personal experience case, personal experience case.
Wow. Interesting. So even all the way through up to the senior partners, they're trying to assess the same information. That's very interesting.
Exactly.
If you had a younger sibling who was really interested in getting into consulting in general or at McKinsey, what's the key advice you would give them to sort of get the interview and succeed in the interview? Yeah.
So I think both those, I'll come to advice from there. I think my first question to this person would be, why do you want to do consulting, right? And this is a thing I've said before, which is, your LinkedIn will celebrate your job like for one day. You've got to live that job for a little longer. And I think a lot of times people don't reflect enough on why do they want to do something without looking at both the pros, cons, and everything has trade-offs in life. And I think run to it for the so-called prestige around it, right? And so my first question would be like, know what you are getting into and ask yourself why, and understand things that this will give you and things that it may not give you. So that's the first thing I'll tell my sibling is, sure, you can do it and it's a great career, but first really ask yourself, like, do I want this and do I want what it comes with, right? Both the pros and the cons. And then it would be a little bit of, in an ideal world, all the firms are great and, you can have a great career everywhere. But I do think having been in a few, there is something about personality and fit. And so I would also say, look, hopefully you have the privilege to choose eventually, where you've interviewed with a few and they've all kind of given you offers, but also in the back of your mind, kind of know that this is the list of the firms I'd go to and this is what I want. And so I also, when I was applying, there were a few firms, and I'm obviously not going to take names, but I was just like, look, I don't want to interview with them. Like just things about how they were structured, work, and even the kind of people I met, I just could not see myself hanging out there or doing that kind of work on a daily basis. So I think once you've done that bit of filtering, then if you want to do consulting, irrespective of the firm you do, like the case interview will be a given, right? Some of the other parts of it might change. And so I tell people the case interview is a lot like, say, the GMAT or the SATs. Different people need different reps to get good at it. But there's still some mechanics of how it happens, right? It's like you don't want to go for a GMAT without preparing for it and just turn up. And for some people, like it works beautifully, right? Like they'd literally arrive at the exam unprepared and they do well, and, kudos to them. But I think most of us need some prep. And so I tell people, if consulting is what you really want to do, case prep is really important. There's obviously enough resources online. A lot of schools have consulting clubs. Just get into that habit of taking cases and doing it, because it's almost like knowing how to play a game. Again, going back to my tennis playing days, if you've practiced enough, when you're actually in the match, you know what to do. And so that's what I tell people. You should have practiced enough that when you're in the interview, you're in flow and you really know what to do, and it's not all awkward and you don't get nervous. You've done it so many times that it just feels like, okay, I know how this works. So that's the other advice, is just like, do case prep. It's a no regret move. And then, each of the firms has a slightly different interview. Each of them are trying to test slightly different things. So it depends on, where you eventually get invited. Do a little bit of homework, because they're all slightly different in how they conduct the interviews.
Can you clarify for me on, asking your sibling about, why do you want to do consulting? But it's not typically part of the process of interviewing.
Yeah. So that was less around, which I should have clarified. The process is obviously the process, but this advice was more, even before you say, I want to do consulting, I just feel a lot of times people just say they want to do consulting or iBanking because it seems, or now it's a lot of it's like product management, right? They just seem like prestigious things to do, and they don't reflect enough on what it means, what are the inherent kind of pros, cons, trade-offs in these professions, what are they getting, what's the cost they're paying. So that was less around Rashi being a consultant or working at a consulting firm interviewing my younger sister. It was more just me advising my younger sister, saying, hey, I can teach you how to prep for these interviews, but do you really want to do this? And if you do, why do you want to do it? Do you know what you're going to get into, right? So that was sort of, it's not part of the formal sort of interview, though in some firms, I suspect this question may come up, right? So like I said, McKinsey will not ask this question, but I cannot speak to other firms. And so there might be, if you get a guest from another firm, they might actually say, the answer to why consulting, why our firm is actually very important.
And, to some degree too, though, like as I think about it, and just listening to your answer, to some degree too, given the nature of the interview process that you guys do, given the sort of the support you give, the prep you give, the amount of work that people really have to be putting to be typically successful, you've probably already gone through that hurdle in your mind of, I really want to do this, because otherwise nobody's going to put in that amount of work.
No, that's probably fair to a large extent, right? Like I think it's true, and this may be just something I noticed in business school. It also was a lot of people, which is and that's fair too, right? People are doing it because they want a summer internship. People are doing it because they want a full-time job. But I think a lot of people were also running to it because, in business school you typically have a lot of competitive people, and in people's heads they already created some pecking order of this is the gold medal, right? Like people who join a certain firm out of school or are in these 2-3 industries sort of won the golden prize at the end of like this 2-year, 1-year MBA. And so, yes, people want to do it because, you're in the gunning and in the race. But a lot of times people start that and get into it. And the only reason for doing it is because everybody else wants it, right? And so I think some of the folks in business school who were very successful were also people who were very clear after doing that little bit of like research and figuring out different career paths, saying, I don't even want to do these two things, right? And I really respected some of them. There were some people who were, the trade-offs of these 4 or 5 professions on my personal life are going to be so much that at this stage of my life and what I want, I don't even want to look at it, right? So that's what I mean when I say that a lot of times, and I know it's easy to say it, but it's I think important to be a little intentional about also what you're getting yourself into without just like doing it because there's mass hysteria and everybody's doing it, right?
It's incredibly important. I mean, and it's incredibly valuable information and this is why some of these coffee chats are so important, because you got to know what you're getting into. You set aside what was said earlier about, the importance of the firm, the importance to you, right? You don't want to like get there and be like, oh my God, this is terrible. I totally don't want to do this. And now what do I do?
Exactly.
Right. Exactly. And so I think it's super important. When you think about the people over time who have stood out to you in the different components, now putting your hat on as an interviewer, the things that the people who stood out to you in either or both components of the interview process you guys do, obviously you're not going to give away the keys to the kingdom, but what are the things where you're like, wow, that person was really exceptional, and this is what sort of struck me as exceptional about them?
Yeah. So again, as with everything, there is like a pretty clear laid out rubric, and there are like things that we're looking for in that, and you kind of grade people on a kind of sliding scale, a score, and you're not doing forced ranking. So it's very like Ashley will only be. I'll only score you on Ashley. It's not like I'm scoring you with a cohort that you're kind of interviewing with. But I think it's a few things, right? So on the case bit, it's a little bit of course, like conceptually how you were, analytically how you were, were you able to sort of problem solve? All that stuff really helps, right? Like, were you able to get the problem, break it down, all that stuff? And I think similarly on the personal experience interview side, it's a little bit of like, did you really listen to the prompt I had? Because I'm asking you a question. Did you just throw out a story because that's interesting, or did you ask it? If I'm asking you questions, are you listening to what I'm asking for and answering? I think the ones who do really well also understand that the minute I stop asking a question doesn't necessarily mean you have to start answering it. It's fair game to always say, can I get a minute to collect my thoughts, right? I think those folks also do very well because it gives them a minute to just gather their thoughts, and then you are able to be concise, and you're able to, very clearly kind of articulate what is it that you are trying to communicate, or that I think really, really helps. I think people who, and then people who treat it as a two-way conversation, right? And so I'm not going to like go and reject you because you're like nervous. It's fine. My job is also to make you feel at ease. But sometimes if you get into it with a mindset of like, this is it, and if I mess up, everything will collapse. I just think you get so much in your head that people then start like fumbling, or they don't answer the question, or they're not fully present, or they're not listening to what I'm saying, or, they're reacting to things which I mean, there are interviews where I've told people, look, you don't have to rush. It's my job to finish this interview on time, right? It's not, you don't have to finish this on time. Like you don't have to rush through it. Like, do you want a minute? So I think just stuff like that is what makes a difference. Though in general, I also feel like you said, because, these are people who've gone through this process. They've obviously worked a lot of times with their schools, Management Consulting Association. They've probably done a bunch of case preps. The firm's invested in them. It's very rare that someone's going to be a complete disaster. Maybe I was when I interviewed for the first time in my undergrad, but for most cases, I'd say people are pretty sort of well prepared, well polished, and it really is like a marginal thing. It's never, oh my God, this person was a complete wreck, right? And if somebody is getting really, really uncomfortable, we're also just taught to put them at ease, right? You don't want people to be breaking down or kind of feeling so much pressure and stress that they can't operate.
Yeah. Okay. That's a lot of interesting stuff there too. And it occurs to me as I think back to the earlier part of our conversation, when the person interviewing you is sort of acting as effectively acting as a client and gives you sort of hints and tries to direct you, it's kind of, again, a proxy for what that person might be able to do in listening to clients when they're in there.
And that was actually a tip someone gave me at business school, like at upper year, which worked beautifully. And, this was back when pre-COVID, so everything was happening in person. And I think some interviews are going back again. We did a bunch of these virtual interviews as did everybody else, but I interviewed in person. And so their big tip to me was, in a lot of rooms, you've got either like square rectangle tables or even circular tables. And traditionally when you're interviewing, I would sit on one end and the interviewer sits on one end. And so there's this gap. And a lot of times when I'm collecting my thoughts, especially when I'm doing like a case, there were two things she said, right? One was like, don't hide your work like this and do it. Like put it in the middle. And if you're thinking and you're sharing, like put it out and share with them the way you with the client. Like, this is how I'm thinking. This is how I'm structuring. This is how I'm breaking down. Invite them in. And then this person said tactically, so I'm just going to use this as an example. If I'm on one side of the table and this person's on the other, ask them and say, hey, if you're comfortable, and just pull your table closer or chair, closer to them, right? So that it also becomes that you both together have this piece of paper that you're working on, versus it feeling like this massive distance and them not understanding your thinking. So I think that also was very, very good advice. And then the third thing I tell people is to take people on your journey and your logic. So especially with cases, it's not a math problem. It's not that if you, in the end, you blurt out 20. That's the right answer, right? Sometimes it's okay. A lot of times, actually, it's very interesting where directionally, you're saying, okay, I need you to be right. You don't have to get the number right to the nth degree, but walk me through your logic. So it's a little bit of, if I ask you something and, we've kind of discussed it, we figured out the big buckets, we've gone and tested a few hypotheses, and then it's like, okay, these are some numbers and you're calculating, tell the equation, right? Say, I'm going to do this, because this. And for me, a lot of times that's it, right? Then if you like sort of, instead of it being 21.253, say it's 21.1, or even if it's like ballpark 20, I'm like, that's good, because I know you'll have Excel and calculators when you're doing this on the job. Like the logic is important. So I think that's the other tip, where it's not like a math problem where you just have to, work in silence for 20 minutes and then blurt out an answer. It's take the interviewer on a journey with you, like you said, proxy for how you'd work with a client, right? Like work on your thinking, pressure test things with them, ask them, does this make sense? Am I this is my hypothesis. This is what I want to test next. Directionally, does that make sense? And they'll say yes, no.
That is such incredibly valuable advice, and probably not the most commonly thing told out there. And I would hypothesize that there's a student who's going to get a job because they listened to this podcast and listened to that. That was super valuable.
I hope so. I hope that's like helpful, because I thought it was incredibly helpful that this upper year gave me these tips, and they seemed like such small micro little things. But I was like, wow, maybe, I don't know, maybe all that made a difference, right? It's all a bunch of these things that add up together.
It all adds up. As we wrap this segment, I know we're pushing time here. We're going to wrap up with one or two more questions. Is there anything we haven't talked about that we should have in terms of advice for students on the getting to the interview stage, succeeding in the interview? Anything in there we haven't talked about we should have?
No, I think we pretty much covered all of it. And like I said, different firms do this differently. But I think if you don't get an offer, or even if you do, I think it's always fair to ask for feedback, because that's never going to be the last interview you do in your life. And so I think that's just the other thing, where rejection hurts, it stings. But instead of just like, I guess, cutting the phone or, just throwing it in a corner, or I think it's always fair to ask for feedback, because if you reflect on it, that's how you get better for the next one, right? So maybe that's the only thing, is just if someone's not offering it, you just ask for it.
I think you hit on something super important. I meant to mention earlier, but I didn't, just to call it out specifically, is, when you didn't get that summer internship the first time, you could have been like, well, that sucks and gotten upset about it. But instead of, you responded in a way that that was probably a good signal for them too, where they're like, okay, this person, doesn't, even if it didn't go the way they wanted, they handled it in a really professional way. And you took the feedback, and from the sounds of things, you integrated that effectively into your interview in the future.
Yes, I mean, definitely the latter I did. The former, I, again, cannot talk to it because I wasn't there, but the latter I certainly did, where I said, okay, this is feedback, and I take the feedback. And the next time I was like, I'm going to do this the second time. And again, going back to having grown up playing tennis, it's also a sport that teaches you a lot about how to very quickly take feedback, because you lose a point and you go and play another and you can still win the game. And that's what I tell people, right? Like tennis is lots of parallels with life. You can lose 2 points, but you can still eventually win the set and the match. And sometimes you can lose a set, but still win a match. And so that's how I would think about it, being, okay, fine, like this didn't work out. I got this feedback. How do I very quickly integrate this feedback and just test it in the next interviews and see?
But even though if you weren't there for their side of the process, you did handle it professionally, and that probably may not have gotten you anything, but it didn't exclude you from something.
Precisely. I think that was probably a key that probably, again, I wasn't in the room, but maybe that was the conversations.
Yeah. So let's wrap up with a couple of quick questions, if I may. I think of, and tell me if I think you probably agree with this, consulting is like a very much understanding business, being curious type of role. One of the things I advise people when they're looking towards the finance side of things is find podcasts and listen to those that help you sort of just develop an understanding of business, and start to try and build some of that pattern recognition if you can before you're even in the role. One, do you generally agree with that? And two, are there any podcasts or books or anything you recommend to people, not necessarily just like get ready for consulting interviews, but to sort of like help drive their thinking?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I don't know if there's like a podcast. I listen to a lot of podcasts, which makes it challenging to name one. But back when I was
interviewing, in and of itself, right? Yeah, the very fact that you do is an important indicator.
Precisely, like all over the place. I like read all over the place. I listen to a lot of podcasts. And so, sure, I think there are like certain things that you can read, which I remember listening to this. There's a Reid Hoffman podcast, or there used to be one. Blitzscaling, maybe it was called, which I thought was fascinating, was business building. I was listening to a few like podcasts around general business tech news just to stay abreast with what's happening. I remember back in the day, and I still do actually, I used to listen to Freakonomics as a podcast. I just used to find it interesting, the way it was kind of done. And then a lot of the consulting firms also have their own podcasts, and that doesn't necessarily mean you listen to like a McKinsey Deloitte podcast, but I think they also sort of break a lot of issues down pretty well. And similarly, when it comes to reading, I would tell people, and I still do, right? Like there's obviously read and chase your curiosity and pick up interesting books. And there's no list of like, you have to read these 5 books. But it's a little bit of, generally like sort of read a business newspaper. You should know what's happening in the world. If there are certain topics or industries you're interested in, read up. I think the other hot tip could be, especially when you're interviewing, a lot of times firms will disclose names of people who are going to be your interviewers. And so do a basic research on them. And this is not to say become completely inauthentic.
So Rashi, this has been such an interesting conversation. I really do appreciate it. You've been very generous with your time, and I really appreciate it. I know our audience does. We will put those links in the show notes, so people will be able to quite easily track that down. Thank you once again. That was awesome. Really appreciate you.